That was Prince starting in 1993, and that protest would continue throughout the mid-90s. The media largely treated it like a publicity stunt. The global superstar was finally losing his mind, or at least that's what they thought. But what if that wasn't just a protest? What if Prince was trying to warn us about how the system actually works, who owns what, who controls what, and how that same system extends far beyond the music industry? The story starts earlier than most people think. In 1977, an 18-year-old from Minneapolis signed a recording contract with Warner Bros. Records. That part isn't unusual. What was unusual was what he negotiated. At a time when labels routinely controlled every aspect of production, what producers were hired, how the record sounded, when it came out, and so forth, Prince secured unusual creative control over his own albums, including the rights to produce his own work at just 18 years old. He wasn't just some talented kid getting lucky. He was setting a very specific expectation. I will deliver finished work on my terms, and the system will keep up. And for a while, that's largely what happened. Throughout the late 70s and into the early 80s, Prince began releasing albums at a pace that was almost impossible to sustain by industry standards. Each record came fast. Each record sounded like it had been made by someone who couldn't stop creating even if they wanted to. And that pace Prince was working at would later become a problem. Then came his biggest commercial release, Purple Rain. And with the commercial leverage that followed, Prince didn't just ask for better terms. He built an infrastructure and launched Paisley Park Records as a Warner-distributed joint venture. Around this time, he also built a Paisley Park studio complex in Chanhassen, Minnesota, a facility designed so that he never had to leave his creative environment to make music. Most artists at that level negotiated better terms. Prince, however, built an alternative pipeline, his own label, his own studio, and the underlying message was structural. If you want freedom, you build leverage because the industry won't grant it by default. And Prince knew the power of owning your own space. Even early on, this wasn't just about making music for Prince. It was about understanding control, something he would keep coming back to later. Now, when artists get to that level, most of them end up moving to Los Angeles, maybe New York, just naturally getting closer to the industry, the labels, the whole system. That's just how it goes. But Prince didn't do that. He famously referred to Los Angeles as a dream factory. He even said he not only dreaded going there, but that he would lose sight of his purpose when he did. So instead, Prince chose to stay in Minneapolis, building his own creative environment instead of moving to LA or New York City. And during media appearances, people kept asking him the same question: why haven't you left Minneapolis? In one interview with Oprah, she asked him directly, and he gave a surprisingly simple answer. He said the cold climate helps keep bad people out.
I know you must perceive yourself as being different. Have you ever perceived yourself as being weird in any way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I understand everything's relative, not weird to me.
And you're living in Minneapolis, of all places.
Minneapolis, yeah. I will always live in Minneapolis.
Do you will always live here? Mm-hmm. Why?
It's so cold, it keeps the bad people out.
In 1992, the press announced what looked like the ultimate validation of Prince's success, a new contract with Warner Bros., widely reported as a $100 million deal, 6 albums. It was framed as the biggest deal in music. Prince was at the top of the world, untouchable. But reports suggested that $100 million number wasn't quite what it seemed. A lot of it wasn't guaranteed. It was conditional. Hit the sales target, get the money, miss them, get a lot less. Some reports estimated the number to be closer to $30 million if sales conditions weren't met. However, what Prince was really focused on here was something the headlines didn't mention at all: ownership and control of his output, which is something that was always important for him since day one. By the early 90s, things came to a head with his record label. See, Prince wanted to release music constantly because that's just who he was. He was a creator at its core, right? But the label had a problem with that. Their worry was that he was putting out too much too fast, flooding the market, stepping on his own sales. They wanted to slow him down, space things out, control the timing, and Prince wanted absolutely none of that. He rejected the strategy entirely. The idea that a label's marketing calendar decides how much music he could put out wasn't something he wanted to adhere to. And here's the thing, Prince wasn't being difficult. He was just an artist who wanted to release his art. The label was a business that needed to manage timing and sales, and those two things were never lining up for him. During this period, Prince was in deep negotiations with Warner, but nothing was moving. And when it became clear that talking wasn't going to get him anywhere, he started communicating it through his art. He released material with artwork that spelled out Prince 1958-1993, which essentially was a visual declaration that the version of himself the label had built was dead. Not because he was going anywhere, but because he was done letting the label own the narrative around who he was. If they controlled his brand, his distribution, his catalog, Then the only thing he had left was his voice, so he used it.
I had searched deep within my heart and spirit, and I wanted to make a change and move to a new plateau in my life. Sort of divorced me from the past and all the hang-up that go along with it, as it's been well chronicled in deep dispute with my record label.
Which is Warner Brothers, right?
Yeah. We had some issues that were basically about ownership of the music and how often I was supposed to record and things like that. I really searched deep within to find out the answer to whether fame was most important to me or my spiritual well-being, and I chose the latter.
By 1993, this wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was a full-blown standoff. Prince had the leverage of being one of the biggest artists in the industry, and Warner had the leverage of controlling the rights to much of the music he'd released. Something had to happen, because at this point, this wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was the beginning of what he was trying to warn people about. In June 1993, Prince changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol, a combination of the male and female signs fused together. The media had no idea what to do with that. How do you write a headline about someone with no name? And that's when they started referring to him as the artist. In press statements from that time, the name change was framed as a step towards liberation from the industry shackles. Prince publicly argued that the label had turned his name into a marketing asset that they controlled. The name change became a way for Prince to, still operate independently, in which he was able to control his career and have his freedom. Because the symbol couldn't be typed, Prince had his team distribute a custom font on floppy disks to media outlets, so journalists could actually print his name in articles. Every reporter who covered him had to physically install his font to write about him. It forced the entire industry and the entire press to confront the underlying claim. This person does not belong to your system. Even discussing him required adapting to his terms. In other words, he was taking control of his own narrative. And then came the moment nobody in the industry could ignore. Prince began appearing in public, at performances and media appearances with the word slave written on his cheek. The message was not subtle. He was one of the most commercially successful musicians in the world at that point. And he was telling anyone who would look that an artist can be rich, famous, and still be owned. Despite his success and unusual creative leverage, he still felt constrained by a contract that affected what he released, how often, and what he actually owned. The public, however, largely responded with mockery. Here was a superstar using the language of slavery, a man with more wealth than most people could ever dream about, comparing himself to an enslaved person. It struck a lot of people as absurd. What Prince was doing was giving a description of a structural reality that later became widely understood across the industry. Under the label machine, performing live is where the artist can be freer and get better compensated for their work, while the actual records can be tightly owned and monetized by the label without you reaping all the rewards. In an interview from this period, Prince described the situation in plain terms. He creates the work, but the company immediately owns it and leases it back to him. Now that phrase, own it and lease it back, wasn't a legal term, so much as Prince's blunt way of describing how these deals can feel from the artist's perspective. They give you access to distribution and resources in exchange for handing over your catalog. That's the trade. And this is where the warning becomes clear, not just about his situation, but about how the system actually works. Around this period, Warner ended its distribution relationship with Paisley Park Records, the record label Prince had built as a buffer against the standard pipeline. When Prince finally completed his Warner obligations and released the triple album Emancipation in 1996, the title was explicit. This was the exit, not just from a contract, but from the system he had been challenging for years. He wasn't only protesting anymore, he was demonstrating a strategy. Finish the deal, reclaim your leverage, and then operate on your own terms. In a Reuters interview archived online, Prince offered a summary of the entire symbol era. He called it directly a stance on ownership against long-term contracts. And that line tells you everything. Not creative differences, not ego, but just a summary of the reality he was living in. What he realized was that long-term contracts lock artists into structural disadvantage, even when they appear advantageous. Even when the headline number is $100 million on the back end, the numbers don't always add up. What Prince was always worried about was ownership of the music, and he wanted to dictate how often he was supposed to record. It was not, as he emphasized, about the label restricting his creative freedom, and that distinction matters for understanding what he was actually warning people about. He was saying that the system's incentives don't align with the artist's freedom, and over time it became clear that problem wasn't limited to record labels alone.
Napster simply facilitates communication among people interested in music.
When Napster emerged, Prince called it exciting from a music lover's perspective, and in the same breath, he attacked the record companies for exploiting artists. Prince argued that online distribution could become the mechanism by which artists finally put an end to that exploitation. Only if, however, artists understood the business well enough to use it that way.
Don't be fooled by the internet. It's cool to get on the computer, but don't let the computer get on you. It's cool to use the computer, don't let the computer use you. You all saw The Matrix. There's a war going on, the battlefield's in the mind, and the prize is the soul. Just be careful.
And years before the creator economy was even a conversation, Prince was already moving differently. He built the NPG Music Club, a platform where he could release music directly to the fans, no label schedules, no retail gatekeepers. He wasn't just fighting the system anymore, he was trying to build around it. But then things got complicated. Around 2007, Prince started aggressively going after unauthorized uploads on the internet, YouTube videos, eBay listings, even platforms like the Pirate Bay, working with anti-piracy firms to remove his music wherever it appeared without permission. And to a lot of people, it looked like he had turned on the internet, but that wasn't really the case. What he had a problem with was losing control of his work. At the same time, he was still experimenting, giving away the album Planet Earth through the British newspaper.
Thank you for the follow, Dreamy.